Okay, well, let's look at some major types of glycerol fatty acid-based lipids. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to do a shorthand representation. I drew you the molecule once, gave you an example of how they're bonding, so let's make things nice and simple. Okay, I'm going to represent the glycerol just by putting 3 carbons here. And a fatty acid is going to be this kind of squiggly line. That's a common chemical representation. Okay, so that's glycerol, that's a fatty acid. Okay, now we already talked about mono and diglycerides, which are used commercially as emulsifying agents in food. But we take a glycerol and put 3 fatty acids in it. Now, by the way, when we do this, you do not have to have the same fatty acid in each of the 3 carbons. You could have, for instance, one has 12 carbons. Another has 22 carbons. Another has 16 carbons. It's perfectly okay. You could have 2 saturated and 1 unsaturated fatty acids. You could have 3 saturated fatty acids, 3 unsaturated fatty acids, whatever. There's no particular rules on that. So you can do a wide range of lipids just by different types of fatty acids attached to the different the carbons of glycerol. So this glycerol and 3 fatty acids is what we call a triglyceride. And what are triglycerides? Triglycerides are commonly known as fats and oils. Fats, of course, are solid. Oils are liquid, but it's the same types of molecules. So that corn oil, that lard, all that kind of stuff, that's triglycerides. Now, what do triglycerides do? What are they used for? They're energy storage for the organisms. Because when they're metabolized, fats and oils contain more than twice as many calories as a comparable mass of sugars or polysaccharides. So if you eat a spoonful of sugar, you get so many calories from it, but if you eat a spoonful of oil, not that I advise that, I knew somebody who drank a cup of oil on a bet, and he actually held it down. I got about $50 for that. And that was a lot of money 30 years ago for a student.
Sounds like a lot of money now.
He did not say how many times he hit the bathroom afterwards, but
$50.
okay. But anyway, if you have a spoonful of oil, you're going to get a lot more calories out of it. Because, and we'll see why. Basically, you generate more energy from breaking down lipids than you do from breaking down sugars and polysaccharides. We'll see why when we talk about energy-producing metabolism much later on in the course. But fats and oils are used as energy storage sources for the organism. Now, once again, what we do is we synthesize these things in the endoplasmic reticulum, so one of the cellular compartments, and they're made and they're packed into another membrane-bound vesicle. So we could call this a lipid vesicle. And inside are all kinds of, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of triglycerides inside. Once again, we have mechanisms that pump the triglycerides out of these storage compartments when the cells effectively are running low on energy, and then they get picked up and metabolized. And all cells are going to have some of these. We find these things in protists, we find these things in fungi, we find not much perhaps, we find them in plants, we find them in animals. Seeds are especially rich, once again, in various kinds of fats and oils and stuff to provide an additional energy source for the growing embryo. So you have something like, okay, well, corn. Corn's got sugar, glucose, corn's got lots of starch in it, and corn has lots of corn oil in it. And then a lot of our nuts are very loaded up with various kinds of oils and stuff. Okay, so it's an energy source. And of course, there are also other plant cells have that too. With animals, we usually store most of our lipids in certain cells are specialized for doing that, where they have huge amounts of lipid vesicles in them. Most cells have relatively small amounts, but some cells are specialized for storing enormous amounts of lipid vesicles. And then, on demand, they can secrete the contents into the bloodstream, and other cells can pick them up and take them in and use them as an energy source. So these cells are storehouses for providing lipids that can be used by other cells. And these are the so-called fat cells or adipocytes. And there's a lot of research going on about the fine control of this mechanism and appetite. There's a number of different hormones, including proteins and in some cases certain kinds of lipids, that are going to regulate lipid uptake, especially in production by these cells, release of the lipids into the bloodstream, and they also regulate appetite. The minute some new part of this complex mechanism comes out, gets discovered, the drug companies flock to the person who discovered it and start beating down the door because they want to make contracts with them and stuff. Because of course, holy grail for a lot of drug companies is to come up with a safe, effective diet pill and make billions and billions of dollars a year from that. Okay, so it's a complex thing involving multiple different kinds of hormones, proteins, peptides, and some lipids that control things that regulate this type of stuff. These fat cells also secrete numerous different kinds of hormones. So, in an organism, many organisms have a layer of fat that provides a storehouse of energy that the rest of the organism can rely on in times of famine and stuff like that. The other thing is fat is also a very good thermal insulator. Hydrophobic molecules are very good. Think of whale blubber. I mean, whales that live, these are warm-blooded organisms, and some of these guys like to live in Antarctic waters. They're hovering just above freezing. The reason they don't freeze to death is they got thick layers of insulating blubber, which also doubles as an emergency energy source too, if they need that. Now, of course, one of the big problems with humans, at least in Western countries, is taking more calories than you actually use up in a day. And many of those extra calories are going to be converted into lipids and stored in your adipocyte. Turns out big people actually probably have very few more fat cells than thin people. But the cells are simply larger. They're packed and swollen with much more lipid vesicles. When you go down to a doctor's office and they do a standard blood test, one of the things they will do is what they call serum triglycerides. If you see that test, okay. What they're measuring is how much fat's floating around your blood. If it's too high, they're probably going to try to put you on a diet. If it's too low, they're going to ask when the last time you ate was, and if it was recently, then they're going to start looking and seeing if you have some other types of problems that are associated with that, not just that you didn't eat for 2 days or something. Okay, so that's a standard thing in a blood test, is how much fat and oil, how much of these triglycerides, these fats, are floating around inside your bloodstream at any given point. Okay, so we store lipids the same kind, very similar to what we see in the case of the polysaccharide. Now you may ask yourself, why do we store metabolic energy in two separate forms? We have one form in the form of polysaccharides like starch and glycogen. And the same organism and often the same cells also store triglycerides. Now why have both? Why not just use one or the other? Well, it turns out they both have certain advantages. And you can take a look at the pluses and minuses. Okay, first thing, obviously you get more bang for the buck from lipids. Metabolizing lipids, gram for gram, ounce for ounce, whatever, gives you more than twice as much metabolic energy as the same amount of sugars or polysaccharides. So lipids are very energy dense. that way you can pack more metabolic energy in a smaller volume in the form of lipids. So that's right now the plus end here. The minus end with lipids is though lipids give you more energy per gram by far than polysaccharides and sugars do, lipids are only metabolized slowly. There are many different steps you have to do to break lipids down into the final molecule we call acetylcoenzyme A that goes in what's called Krebs cycle. It takes a lot of steps to do that. It takes a lot of time. Basically, you have to tear the fatty acids off the glycerol and then chop each fatty acid into 2 carbon fragments and to modify those fragments before you get the energy out of it. So it takes a long time. It's slow to metabolize. Polysaccharides, on the other hand, can be metabolized very quickly. You break the polysaccharides down to sugars. If there are sugars that are other than glucose, you can quickly interconvert one 6-carbon sugar to another and turn it back into glucose and then metabolize. Glycolysis, the anaerobic process, is very quick. That's why we have lots of glycogen in our muscle cells. And even the further metabolism of sugars like glucose takes a lot less than the metabolism of fatty acids. So it's rapid metabolism. So by storing metabolic energy in both forms, we effectively have 2 kind of bank accounts for metabolic energy. We have a short-term account that's quickly metabolized but doesn't pack as much energy in. And we have a long-term account, the lipids, that pack a lot more energy but are much slower to metabolize. So we got energy for quick purposes and we got sort of more slowly used energy reserves. It's like when you folks finish school and go on and actually get jobs and salaries and things like that. You may well have a couple different kinds of bank accounts. You'll probably have a checking account that gives you little or no interest at all, but it's easy to access. All you have to do is write a check or whip out your check card or whatever the case is, and you got access to your money. You may well also have some kind of investment account for long-term things like retirement or down payment on a house or whatever the case, kids' education, whatever the case is. And you might put it in any of the things, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, bank certificates of deposit, what have you. And those offer at least the potential of a higher rate of return, more interest. It's always a little hard to say with some of these things.
Depends on inflation.
Yeah, more interest, but they're harder to access. You can't just whip out a check card and pull money out of something. A lot of these accounts, you have to keep a certain amount in there at all times and stuff. So you have short-term accounts for immediate uses, long-term accounts that give you a higher rate of return, at least in theory, but they're harder and slower to access the money from. So that a lot of people do that. And in effect, cells do the same thing by a short-term account in polysaccharides and a long-term account in lipids. Okay, that's one major class of lipids. Now let's take a look at a couple others.